Hi, welcome back to part 9 in this top-down, center-out video series. Today, we're transferring our adjustments from our toile back to our original pattern pieces. And this is the last step in the top-down, center-out method before we get to construct our final garment. Now, there are lots of ways to do this. I will highlight a couple of ways that I've used before to transfer my adjustments, but these are not the only ways. So you should use whatever methods you like best and that work for you, and you can get creative with this. Let me show you a few ways that I've transferred my adjustments from my toile fabric back to my original pattern pieces. First, let me recap where I am with this toile. So this is the toile that I have basted together at the end of the fitting process described in the previous video. And you can see in black here, I've drawn on the location of my new seam lines. So this thick black line is the new seam lines I determined when I was fitting. I've basted along this line to attach the side seams together where I've changed the seam and to attach the waistline seam to the waistband seam. Incidentally, one reason why it's important to baste the new seam lines together before I transfer adjustments is because it helps me check that the length of my new waistline seam from center front to center back is going to match up with the length of my waistband seam from center front to center back. There may be a little bit of excess in the pants waistline that needs to get eased into the waistband as I'm sewing, and that's okay. But if there are any big discrepancies as I'm basting, then I can go back and recheck the fit on my toile. Okay, so in black is the new seam line, and this thin blue line here, that is the original outline of the pattern piece that I started with. So you can see that I've added length in the front and I've taken in the side seam here. To transfer these adjustments, the first step is to take apart this toile. So I'm going to seam rip all of the seams, and it helps that I've used a basting stitch to assemble this. And then I'm going to carefully press the fabric pieces since they've gotten a little bit crumpled since my fitting. And when I'm pressing, I'm going to be making sure that I'm not stretching or warping the fabric at all. Then I'll come back and I'll show you how to transfer your seam lines with a couple of different methods. The first way to transfer your adjustments back to your pattern is to use transfer paper. This is a product that comes in large sheets like this, and on one side it is coated with wax or chalk. I personally prefer the wax-based transfer paper, but you can also get the chalk-based transfer paper from places like Wawak and other sewing supply stores, and I'll put a link for where I get this in the description of this video. So the first step is to lay your transfer paper down with the chalk or the wax side facing up. Then you will lay your traced pattern piece on top of that. So you can see here is my pattern piece. This is my original pattern line. And I've added fabric at the top and along the sides here. On top of this, I will lay my pressed toile fabric that corresponds to this pattern piece, and I'm going to align this toile fabric as best I can so that all of the darts, the notches, everything matches up to this pattern piece as well as possible. Then I take my tracing wheel and I simply roll over my new seam lines here in the dark black line that I mentioned earlier. I'm just rolling right over them. And then what you can see is, if I turn this over, that new seam line has been copied onto my pattern piece. You can see in the red here, now I've got my new seam lines copied directly onto this pattern piece. And the next step is I can tidy up this line with a ruler or a curved ruler so that these lines are smooth and sewable if I think they need to be tidied a little bit. And then I will add back my seam allowances. So remember, this is my sewing line, not my cutting line. So I need to add back my seam allowances wherever I've changed my seam lines. If you don't have transfer paper, there are other ways to transfer your adjustments. Sometimes I will take a ruler and measure how much I've increased or decreased each seam line using the reference lines already on my toile. So in that case, I'm just measuring the distance from my new seam line to some other reference point on the toile. So in this case, the edge of the original pattern. So let's say I wanted to copy over this side seam. I would just measure at the top here, it is 1 inch in from this outer corner, and it blends into the original seam line about 6 inches down from the top. So I would simply go to my pattern piece, I would make a mark 1 inch in from the sides, the side of the pattern piece up here, and a mark 6 inches down, and then I would connect those two lines. And again, remember, this is your seam line, so I would then add back my seam allowances. Be aware that if you're using this method, it can be a little bit tedious if there are a lot of changes, and it can also be less accurate, but I've certainly used this method before with good results. There's also a third method that I've seen people use to transfer their adjustments without using transfer paper. In this method, you take apart your toile, press it, and then you would pin your fabric toile pieces to their corresponding traced pattern pieces. Then you would take that and tape it to a large window or a glass door, being careful not to introduce any distortion into those pieces. Then you could effectively use the window or door as a light box to see through the two layers at the same time. Then you can trace over your new seam lines to transfer them onto your tracing paper. Regardless of which method you choose, remember you are tracing your seam lines, not the cutting lines. So you will have to add back your seam allowances for any new seam lines that you've traced. Once I've traced all my seam lines and I've added back my seam allowances, then there's a few things I like to double check before I cut into my final fabric. The first thing is to add back the front pockets on the front pants piece if I filled them in while I was tracing the pattern to begin with. Let me show you how I do that. Here is a different pattern piece. This is one with a front pocket. I've removed the shaping elements just to make it a little bit easier to see, but this is the original top of the pattern. This is the scoop front pocket, and then this is the original side seam. And you can see I've filled in this top corner here for the pattern preparation that we talked about earlier. Now that I've transferred my adjustments back to this pattern piece, you can see in the red line here, that's my new seam line for the waistline and my new seam line for the side seam. So to transfer this back to the pocket pieces, I simply take my pocket pieces. This is my pocket bag. I've intentionally left some extra tissue on the side and the top of this piece because I knew I was going to change the seam lines here. I will simply align this pocket bag with the notches, and I can see where I need to move my seam lines. So I can either trace these new seam lines onto the pocket bag and pocket lining pieces using the transfer paper, or I can simply take a ruler and just trace the outline that I can see. And obviously I need to add back my seam allowances too, so don't forget to do that on your pocket bags and your pocket linings. Next, you can lengthen the pant legs if you need to at this stage. Remember, I didn't lengthen before because I want to keep the hem of my toile up off the floor as I'm fitting, but I'm tall, so I usually need to lengthen my pants, and I do it now at this stage. Next, I double check my zipper closures or button flies, whatever closures I have on the pants that I'm making. If you want your closures to be at the same length as the original pattern calls for, then you may need to move that closure up or down if you've added fabric or removed fabric along the waistline. Finally, I check that the length of the waistband seam will match up with the length of the waistline seam on the pants. So remember, we checked this before when we basted everything together, but it's a good idea just to do a final check now that you've got everything transferred to your pattern pieces. If there's any discrepancies, you may need to go back to your toile. And that's it. Once you've done all of those checks, you're ready to cut into your final fashion fabric. Constructing your final garment out of the fashion fabric that you chose is a different skill set than fitting a toile. A lot of the conventional methods for fitting will have you combine those two, and they instruct you to try on the final garment as you're constructing it to assess the fit at multiple stages. And this can be problematic because if the fashion fabric is overhandled, then it can stretch or warp or otherwise affect the fit as you are constructing this garment. The thing I like about top down, center out is that we've gotten the fitting decisions out of the way. We know this design is going to fit us, and we can cut into our fabric with confidence and really just focus on the construction at this point. It is recommended to try on your final garment one more time only after you've attached the waistband. At that point, you can assess the fit, and if you need to make any minor tweaks, then you can do that using the seam allowances of the garment. Of course, your fashion fabric is likely to behave differently than whatever fabric you use to make the toile, so some minor tweaks are normal and expected. But because we've gotten all of the major fitting decisions out of the way, these minor tweaks are going to be much easier to execute in this final construction stage. In closing, I want to emphasize here that once you understand the key elements to the top-down, center-out method and what is required to make it work, you can really work within that framework to find the strategies that are the best for you and that help you execute it. So, for example, there are a lot of different ways to transfer your adjustments from your toile back to your pattern pieces. Whichever way you decide, it's up to you to figure out how you want to balance things like accuracy with easy or efficient execution. And the same is true for other points along the top-down, center-out process, like preparing your pattern pieces and preparing your toile. Ultimately, this method is very flexible and very adaptable, and that's what makes it so generally applicable to lots of different types of designs and different patterns. In future videos, I will explore how to adapt this method to some of those other types of designs, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Happy sewing.